Hello there and welcome to another edition of Ask David. I'm joining you indoors this week because outside we've got this rain has set in, this autumnal wind and rain, and that really does mark the end of summer. Full stop really, doesn't it? There's still plenty of plants in flower in the gardens and they're still looking quite good, but as those day lengths start to shorten, we should start to turn our attention to some of the pests and diseases and getting on top of them before the winter draws in, and also dealing with plants that might need some protection from any frosts that are just lurking around the corner. So hopefully this weather will cheer up and next week I'll be able to join you again back in my garden. But let's deal with some of the questions that you've sent in this week. So first, Steve's got in touch about a magnolia that he has growing in his garden. He says that it's planted in a shady place. It hasn't grown very much. It does flower, but he's wondering if he moved it to a sunnier position, whether it would grow better and therefore do better and probably produce more flowers. I think it sounds like it might be one of the smaller growing magnolias, to be honest, because if it's been in for quite a while, the larger growing ones, things like Soulangiana, will grow quite readily if they're well established and grow on probably around about 20 to 30 centimetres a year of growth, and so should be getting larger and larger. If it's one of the stellata types though, the smaller growing magnolias, then they do tend to stay more compact. But I think it probably would do your magnolia some good if you dug it up and either replanted it in the same position or in a slightly sunnier position, but improve the soil tremendously when you replant it. So that means digging in plenty of organic matter and getting the soil in really good condition so that your magnolia can reroot, get its roots down during the winter and then grow away strongly next spring. And now is a really good time to do that, lifting and replanting, if you like, because the soil is moister thanks to all this rain we're having at the moment, but the soil is still moderately warm, and plant roots, even though the leaves might be falling from the plants, plant roots do carry on growing underground during the winter. So doing it now will get your magnolia really well established, ready to grow away next year. Next, Asia wants to know about nettle and comfrey feeds and whether she can use them for house plants. Asia, do you know what? This is a really interesting question, and it's one that I've actually never been asked about for growing house plants, and whether those homemade feeds, liquid feeds, will do your house plants any good. And the answer simply is yes, it will do those plants good. You can use those homemade comfrey and nettle feeds indoors on your plants. Remember to dilute them at about 1 part of the liquid feed solution that you make to about 10 parts of water. So dilute it well, and you only need to apply it probably once every 3 to 4 weeks. Doesn't need lots of it, particularly during the winter months when the plants aren't growing very much. But the one word of warning would be if you make a regular standard comfrey or nettle feed, which involves packing a bucket with the leaves and then pouring on water and leaving it covered up to rot down over a number of weeks, you'll probably find that the resultant liquid will be quite pongy. So I would pack the nettle and the comfrey leaves dry into a bucket, pack them as tightly as you possibly can, and then cover with a lid and leave them to break down and die down naturally of their own accord and gradually decompose. Put it somewhere sheltered so that the leaves will die down, and the resultant liquid you will find, if you don't put any water onto it initially, the resultant liquid won't smell anywhere near as bad as if you put the leaves into a bucket of water. So that would be my word of warning, because you don't want ponky feed applied to your houseplants indoors. So there we are. Keep applying your homemade feeds to your houseplants as well as your outdoor plants. Next, Cathy says that she's got some orange fungal material on the leaves of her pear trees. She says it's now flowering, as she puts it in inverted commas, which I think suggests it's starting to produce its fungal spores, and those fungal spores will shed from the pear tree leaves and reinfest neighbouring plants, particularly junipers. Now this is a fungus called pear rust, and it has a very interesting life cycle that is split between two host plants. One is the pear tree, where you see those orange pustules on the leaves at this time of year, shedding fungal spores that go off and reinfest other plants. But the other host is the juniper. And so what those spores will do is they'll find a juniper plant as their alternative host to overwinter, if you like, and they will start to grow on that juniper host plant, and then in the spring you may notice a jelly-like substance on the foliage of the juniper, and spores will be released, different types of spores will be released from that jelly-like substance on the foliage, and they will go on to infest the pear foliage, which you're now seeing at this time of year. So it's quite a complicated interrelationship between the fungus and two separate host plants. So have a look if you've got any junipers in your garden, because they will be the hosts, and you will only see the signs of that fungus in the spring on the junipers. Now the best way to control it is to prune out any infected parts on the juniper plants in the spring, so that you're taking off the jelly-like structures that would release the spores that would go on to reinfest your pear tree. So look out in the spring and cut out any pieces that are heavily infested on the juniper plants. Meanwhile, at this time of year, you'd be well benefited from taking off some of the really badly infested leaves on the pear tree to try and reduce the number of spores that are being released. And of course, when it comes to the leaves falling from the pear trees in a few weeks' time, collect all those leaves up, and I would either bin or burn them rather than putting them onto a compost heap. It's a good idea to burn or bin those leafy remains from the pear tree so that the fungal spores, any additional fungal spores, can't be released. So that would be my advice of how to control your pear rust. Eterna has got in contact about some dahlia plants and has said that these dahlias have been bought quite late on in the season in pots, and the questioner wants to know whether the plants should either be planted out in the garden, even though it's quite late in the season, or whether they should be overwintered somehow in the pots that they've been bought in. And my advice would be to keep the dahlias in those pots and keep them somewhere out of the worst of any frost. So a frost-free cold greenhouse would be ideal, or a frost-free shed. Leave the plants to die down, turn yellow and then brown. Leave them to die down naturally at the end of the season, so they can be left outside all through the autumn until the first hard frost is forecast, and then just as that first frost is forecast, bring those plants indoors to protect them from the frost, but allow them to dry out naturally and for the foliage to die down before you bring them in to store them, and then store them dry during the remains of the autumn, on into the winter and on into the beginning of the spring, and restart them into growth probably in around about March time by just adding a little bit of water to the pots to re-wet the compost and get those dahlias back into growth. But my advice would be to leave them in the pots, don't play around with them too much, keep them somewhere frost-free and restart them into growth next year. And lastly this week, Gillian has got in touch and she sent me a really nice photo of a plant in her garden. She says she originally bought it as a ribes, or a flowering currant, so she understood, but she says it has broadly similar foliage, but it doesn't smell of, as she puts it, cat pee. So she doesn't think it is a ribes and she wants to know what it is. Gillian, this is a rubus, not a ribes, so I wonder whether you misheard or whether you just misremember, but it is a very, very beautiful plant. And as you say, the flowers are reminiscent of a single rose flower, and it flowers really well in summer and on into early autumn. So this is rubus rather, and I think it's Rubus tridel, Tridel. I think this is the variety that you've got. Anyway, if you look up rubus and you look at the large white flowered varieties, I think you'll find that that's one and the same thing that you've got growing in your garden. It likes a sunny position to do really well, very free flowering once it's fully established, and a really easy care shrub. So I really thoroughly recommend it. So enjoy your rubus, Gillian, and just relish those flowers. So that's all the questions that we've got time for this week. Hope you've enjoyed the answers. We'll be answering more of your questions next week on Ask David, and hopefully that weather will have improved.